This past week, the Wall Street Journal noted the parade of Democrats lining up behind Zohran Mamdani for mayor of New York City continues to grow. And the latest convert is House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. Just a few days earlier, on the October 23rd All In podcast, former Democratic Senator Joe Manchin commented about the deep divide in his own party. The bottom line is, he said, I've been telling them for the longest time the D brand is toxic. And the reason it's toxic is because you've allowed the far left progressive wing of our party to define who we are. This is a battle for the soul of the Democratic Party. Are we going to be a party that's inclusive of all Democrats? Or is this going to be a party of the far, far left? End quote. Hi, I'm Todd. I've had the good fortune to live the American dream and to watch that dream become a reality for many others. These podcasts and my free Substack newsletter are my way of passing on some of what I've learned along the way. After a short break, we'll come back to look further at what is dividing the modern Democratic Party and what history has to teach us about this. One of the biggest issues for today's Democrats is the divide between the socialist wing of the party headed up by Zohran Mamdani, AOC, Bernie Sanders, and others, and the capitalist wing that more or less defined the party up through the Clinton years. And indeed, this is a battle that has been playing out for some time. In 2015, during the first Democratic presidential debate, Hillary Clinton was forced to defend herself on this very issue. She responded, quote, I don't think you understand what I'm saying. I'm not defending the wildness of capitalism. I'm defending the capitalism that created the middle class in this country. End of quote. While these issues are coming to a head in the modern Democratic Party, this is merely the most recent round in a debate that has been playing out for centuries. Should economies be directed by the guiding hands of political leaders and their brain trust of advisors, or by what Adam Smith called the invisible hand of free markets? While this debate was originally philosophical and intellectual in nature, we now have the benefit of centuries of real-world data to evaluate it. Let's begin with the pre-capitalism era, which, using British economist Angus Madison's timeline, roughly lasted from 1500 to 1820. Unless you were born into a ruling family, a member of the brain trusts that advised them, or a member of the military that fought to defend and expand their territory, the pre-capitalism era was not an especially pretty time to be alive. According to Steven Pinker in Enlightenment Now, in 1800, no country in the world had a life expectancy above 40. With respect to infant mortality, Pinker noted that, well into the 19th century, in Sweden, one of the wealthiest countries, between a quarter and a third of all children died before their 5th birthday, and in some years the death toll was close to half. During this long period, the authoritarian hands of nobility and their brain trust guided economies, and the consequences were also reflected in a lack of economic growth. According to British historian Angus Madison, GDP, or gross domestic product, in Western Europe grew at an anemic 0.4% annually from 1500 to 1820. And while this was actually above the rest of the world, it nevertheless left the masses mired in poverty for centuries. Then, as the invisible hand of capitalism spread, things suddenly and dramatically changed. In the late 1700s, observing the changes taking place in the world around him, Adam Smith laid out the philosophy of what we would today call free market capitalism. Quote, every individual intends only his own gain, And he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part his intention. End of quote. Smith was saying that individuals seeking their own self-interest in a marketplace where providers compete to meet those needs would ultimately and unintentionally lead the economy as a whole to the highest levels of prosperity for the greatest number of people. And this is exactly what happened. After growing at 0.4% annually for hundreds of years, Western European growth spiked up to roughly 5 times to a little over 2% from 1870 to 1913. In the United States, where Smith's limited government ideas were adopted even more completely, growth rates were roughly double those experienced in Western Europe, which is why, as Hillary Clinton acknowledged, this period created the middle class in this country. Now, as noted in previous posts, we can tell how working class people actually felt about capitalism by following their footsteps, as tens of millions voluntarily migrated from the farms to the cities and immigrated from abroad to pursue what became known as the American dream. In 1800, the United States population was a little over 5 million. By 1900, it was an astounding 76 million. Nevertheless, even as all of this transpired, intellectuals sought to portray things in a very different light. In the mid-1800s, Karl Marx moved to Paris, where he became an integral part of the city's thriving socialist community. Failing to recognize the message being sent by the tens of millions drawn like bees to honey away from politically driven systems and towards capitalism, Marx instead portrayed the new model as a form of ruthless, unmanaged exploitation of the working class. In other words, rather than seeing how rapidly the economic pie was finally expanding for everyone under capitalism, he viewed it through the soot-tinted lens of stagnation that had defined politically driven systems for centuries. Marx's solution to a problem that largely existed in the minds of the intellectual classes, who, incidentally, were being disenfranchised by Smith's market-based system, was class warfare. If nothing else, it is remarkable how little the rallying cry for socialism has changed in the centuries since. Marx's ideas inspired the Bolshevik Revolution that led to the Soviet Union and later China's turn to communism. Unfortunately, no one suffered more from the failure of communism than the working class people who were supposed to be its greatest beneficiaries. By the time of Chairman Mao's death in the late 1970s, there were over 500 million people living on less than $2 a day in China alone. And the results in the Soviet Union were only marginally better. In large part over the fears that Marxist-inspired revolutionaries would overthrow other established governments in Europe, as later happened with the Bolsheviks in Russia, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck introduced social welfare programs in the 1880s. Other European countries followed suit, giving rise to what became known as European, or eventually democratic socialism. While, unlike in communism, these systems operated under democratically elected political regimes and maintained private ownership of property, socialism differed from market-based capitalism in that the political and intellectual classes took an increasingly dominant role in guiding economic outcomes through heavy taxation and redistribution and economic regulation. While the results so far have not been as disastrous as what happened with communism, they paled in comparison to the much more market-oriented model of the United States, which we can see by tracking our output relative to the major European economic powers, Germany, the United Kingdom, France, and Italy, over time. In 1820, US GDP was only about 7% of major European economies. But by 1913, it was already almost 75%. And today, our output is over 200% of the countries that, just 2 centuries ago, dominated the Western world. Furthermore, as I've discussed previously, this difference would be even greater if our failed understanding of the Great Depression had not led us into a more top-down, brain trust-driven system that has caused our own growth rates to diminish over time. Even as socialism has continuously disappointed, the world's brain trust has evolved from championing communism to European democratic socialism, and now to what is often called Scandinavian socialism, which effectively represents a small segment of socialist European countries that have fared better than the others. But one problem with this argument is that these countries represent a remarkably small subset of the number of people who have lived under failing socialist systems. One way to put this perspective, to look at this perspective and put it in context, is to look at the population of the categories of socialism discussed above. In 1973, at the peak of communism, there were roughly 1.6 billion people living under socialist regimes. Nearly 80% of those 1.6 billion were trapped in the disastrous systems of communism discussed above. About 20% were trapped in the slow growth of European democratic socialism, and just 17 million, or about 1%, benefited from the relatively better performance of Scandinavian socialism. This makes those using the Scandinavian systems as an argument for the model as a whole a bit like a doctor delivering the news that, sadly, you're dying, but your toenail infection is suddenly doing much better. Now, a related problem with the Scandinavian model is its inability to spread its benefits to meaningful numbers of people. Advocates like to tout Scandinavian socialism because the GDP per capita, or economic output per capita, of these countries averages almost 72,000 versus just 49,000 in the large European socialist countries. But keep in mind, the Scandinavian countries still lag GDP per capita in the United States, which is over 86,000. Furthermore, while the Scandinavian countries have relatively high incomes compared to their underperforming socialist peers, they have come nowhere near the United States in help lifting the masses up out of poverty. While the combined population of the Scandinavian countries was similar to the United States in 1800, the Scandinavian countries have since grown by just under 18 million people, whereas the United States has grown by over 340 million people in the same time period. In other words, there is little here to suggest that Scandinavian socialism is a solution for either large countries like the United States or for solving the problems of more than a few people fortunate enough to be born into such societies. Lastly, even in the Scandinavian countries, growth has long lagged the United States, and recently has fallen off even more dramatically. So far in the 2020s, they have grown at less than half the rate of the United States. In summary, nearly 2 centuries ago, Karl Marx created a narrative of working class exploitation and class warfare that inspired communism, scared Europe into democratic socialism, and has come to define progressivism in today's U.S. democratic politics. But none of these socialist systems that followed has come even remotely close to creating the upward mobility that market-based capitalism has. And our own system of growing brain trust interventions has long underperformed what we were able to do for working class citizens and immigrants during the long limited government era that preceded the Great Depression. Nevertheless, the far left that, according to former Democratic Senator Joe Manchin, is fighting for control of the party, refuses to acknowledge, let alone teach our students, what 2 centuries of evidence should have taught them. Perhaps the next phase of this evolution should simply be called political socialism. Today we face important challenges, but none that are greater than those we have overcome time and again throughout our storied history. Here's to hoping your day is as bright as America's future. I'm Todd. Thanks for your interest. If you found this helpful, please subscribe and recommend it to at least one other person. If you'd like to learn more and to find links to my free On Wealth and Progress newsletter and my book, please visit my website, toddsheetswriter.com. Thanks again.